Well, hello and welcome. It's hard to believe it, but we are starting a brand new year. This is actually our first event of 2022. It's hard to believe it's 2022. It's hard to believe now the Alliance has been here for about 3 years. Started the Alliance about 3 years ago. My name, of course, is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. For those of you that might not know, I started this Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint about 3 years ago. And it was really in response to a personal story. My family had been affected by restraint and seclusion. My son had been inappropriately restrained and secluded in a school in Maryland. And that led me to trying to find answers and trying to figure out why this was happening and what we could do to prevent things like restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, all the negative things happening to kids, often in the name of behavior. So, of course, we have a very clear mission, which is about, really educating the public and connecting people together that are dedicated to changing minds, laws, policies, and practices, so that practices like restraint and seclusion are reduced and eliminated from schools across the nation and really beyond. We have a international audience. We have people from all over the world, from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand, from the UK. Lots of folks that are part of our community, and very, very happy to have all of you as part of our community. Again, while our focus may be on restraint and seclusion, it's really about so much more. It's about all the things that we can do better to better support kids and have better outcomes. Our vision related to restraint and seclusion is about safer schools for students, teachers, and staff. And we firmly believe that we can do that. We can reduce these negative things and do much better for everyone involved. So today, I am very happy to have another amazing guest. So today we have Connie Persike joining us. And Connie is a highly experienced speech and language pathologist and an educational consultant. Connie's going to be talking to us about how to move beyond behaviorism and using new lenses for assessing behavior. And all of you that have been part of our community probably recognize that we have a lot of concerns about the models that are out there today in terms of how people are working with kids that are having behaviors of concern, how much of that is focused on behaviorism. So I think this will be a really great session today. I do want to let you know a couple housekeeping things before I bring Connie on. One is, if you have questions, feel free to ask those during the presentation. You can use the chat box there and ask your question. And Connie and I have agreed that during the presentation, I might jump in with questions or comments. I might bring up your questions or comments as well. So it's going to be kind of a dialogue, so don't think that I'm just jumping in to interrupt. We've kind of agreed that it's really helpful to kind of make it a discussion. As always, I want to let you know that today's session is being recorded and it will be available to listen to after the fact or view on Facebook or YouTube, and also as an audio podcast. And you can find that on Spotify or Apple Podcast, anywhere that you might listen to podcasts. So with all of that, let's get to the good part. Let me go ahead and introduce Connie. So I'm going to go ahead and bring Connie up here and give you a little introduction before we give Connie a chance to tell us a little bit more. So Connie is a highly experienced speech and language pathologist, as I mentioned, over 20 years of experience in educational settings, holds a certificate in instructional coaching, positive education, and applied educational neuroscience. Has served as a member of the multi-state work group to help develop the Common Core essential elements for English language arts. Connie is a published writer for Autism Parenting Magazine and writes for Exceptional Needs Today. She created an innovative process to assess student behavior, which really deviates from the traditional approach of behaviorism and aligns with current relational and neuroscience-based models while maintaining a trauma-sensitive neurodiversity approach. Connie works from the guiding mission that connection and collaboration equal endless possibilities. And all of those of you that are familiar with the work that we do will know that really resonates with all of us, probably, the importance of connection and collaboration versus the many things that we're doing. So let me introduce Connie, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Connie here in a second. But Connie, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us today. And I'm really excited about your presentation today.
Oh, thank you, Guy. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
That's fantastic. And of course, you and I met, it was probably, I want to say almost a year ago, although my timeline might be off a little bit. I had gotten the honor to join one of the classes that you were taking with Dr. Lori Desautel, the Applied Educational Neuroscience. And Lori had asked me to come and talk about restraint and seclusion, which was really a great honor. But I think even more, one of the things that came out of that was the ability to connect with you and a number of the people that were in your cohort that are out there doing amazing work. And recently I've had the opportunity to kind of talk with you and collaborate with you and work, alongside each other kind of with this similar mission, and really excited about, I think as we've talked about the fact that those of us that are trying to make a difference can kind of come together and, try to do better is really important. So I appreciate you and the work that you've been doing. And it's been an honor to get to know you and see the things that you're working on. So thank you for all of that. And I'm really excited today to have that opportunity now to share it with our community, for people to see the things that you're working on. Really, really excited. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring your slide deck up here. Sure. And bring that onto our screen and let you kind of take it away. I'm going to mute myself because for whatever reason, my dogs are going crazy. Hopefully there's a good delivery out on my front porch. But in the meantime, I might be jumping in with some comments and questions. And I do want to say before we get really rolling here, that those of you that are watching, if you do have a question or a comment as we're going, again, please feel free to put that in the chat, and I'll try to keep an eye on those, and we'll kind of pop up with those as we go. So, Connie, with all that, take it away.
And I was going to say, I'm glad you mentioned your dogs. I have 2 dogs. They're both in their kennels right now. Hopefully they're not going to bark, but if they do, I apologize.
Well, and I'll let you know, don't panic if it happens. We are a pet-friendly, kid-friendly, group, and certainly these events are so, my son gets home from school in about 45 minutes. Who knows, he might come in here and start talking to me about, what he wants me to go do with him tonight. So no worries at all.
Good, because I do have a kid in the background also.
Yeah, so all of that is fine. And those that are watching right now from home or wherever they might be, could very likely be in the same circumstances. So no problem at all. In fact, somebody just weighed in and said that, they have 7 cats. And we've all been on the Zoom meeting where we've seen suddenly the tail come across the screen. So yes. All of that is good. So with that, go ahead and take it away.
My most memorable moment, quick story, of virtual shutdown last year was I was actually facilitating a question and answer session for Mona Delahook, who we brought into a Wisconsin conference. And in comes my 75-pound dog and puts her hand up right next to me as I'm trying to formulate all these questions to her. So yes, you will get realism with me. Yeah. So
that's great. That's great. Well, we look forward to it. So we would love to see the dog that knows. So, anything happens, we're good.
Okay. Well, thanks for the introduction, Guy. And just real briefly, I kind of want to just share a little bit about what led me on this journey. I started my own business about 8 years ago now. And I never really, it was focused on students who were struggling with behavior in the school, and the school districts would call me in to give some supports. And I never really thought that people would be asking me to do functional behavioral assessments. That thought just didn't occur to me ahead of time. And once those requests started coming in, and I was in a school district near Madison, Wisconsin, and we had a fairly decent functional behavioral assessment approach. We definitely didn't, use a lot of rewards and punishments to change behavior. We still, though, had some of the traditional functions of behavior that we were looking at. And I remember, we used a great team approach. We brought in, different, I guess if you want to say experts, but people with different backgrounds, so that we would get a nice, well-rounded perspective of what potentially could be some of the areas of concern or some of the areas we needed to support around students. But I always still sat down at that behavior meeting to find supports, and struggled with having enough of the information to really do anything. Oftentimes I felt like we'd go through the functional behavioral assessment, we'd all sit down, we'd try to come up with a plan that was supportive of students' needs, and we'd just all kind of stare at each other and have some difficulty. So I started on this journey somewhat selfishly, so that I could, sleep at night. I always joke, so that I could do something that I liked. And the more and more I learned about Ross Green and lagging skills. And, as a state, we consult with Ross Green, so he's in our state often. The more of a struggle I had with functional behavioral assessments. And so I started to just over the years, create my own forms. I'd use them for a little bit. I'd tweak them after almost every experience. And so that's what's kind of led me to this topic.
I was just going to say, I remember not that long ago when we were connecting and you were talking about the work you were doing on kind of this different approach. And you mentioned I have a functional behavior assessment and I'd like you to look at it. You probably remember my reaction, which was something along the lines, I hate functional behavior assessments. And you're like, exactly. I do too, and it's, really, I think a great part of your journey kind of, realizing that the system was not giving the results that were really needed or mindful or respectful of the people that were being worked with. And, a lot of the, I think we shared some conversations about a lot of the same concerns around those models. So, I just, as we begin to talk about this and those of you that are out there that are listening that hear functional behavior assessment and like me kind of say, oh no, here it goes. You're really in for something I think that you're going to be really excited about. I know, having had the opportunity to kind of see the work that you're doing on this, it's really amazing. So anyway, I just wanted to share that because I thought it was relevant to this journey. It's just that, that whole experience that you had.
Yeah. And well, it's kind of funny because I reached out to Guy initially and said, hey, you want to take a look at the functional behavioral assessment I'm working on? And I've revamped it. And it took let's be honest, it took a little while for you to get back to me, probably because you're like, I don't want to look at this thing. But as you said in your first email, you were pleasantly surprised. Definitely it is a goal of mine to bring people. My goal is not to change it so drastically that I lose people along the way. If there was a component I could keep, I tried to keep it because my entire goal is to replace what we're doing with this new approach. I don't want to lose people along the way and have them just go back to those traditional models and approaches. So we can just jump in. Let's see if I can change my pages. Why is it not changing? Come on, it was working before.
You may need to click on that actual screen or tab sometimes when it's lost focus for a second.
Nope. Now do you see it?
There we go.
I just have to go to that tab, so I can't see you. That's kind of a bummer. Okay, so what we're going to cover today, those of you who have data discussions or discussions that are around data, this is a really nice data discussion protocol. And as I was preparing this presentation, I'm like, hey, it kind of works. So it's called the here's what, so what, now what data protocol, and I just embedded it into my presentation. It's a nice way of looking at facts without everybody getting emotionally, hung up on what we're talking about. And so here's what we're going to just look backwards so that we can move forward. I do want to talk briefly, given this audience, and I think your audience in particular, Guy, probably knows a lot about behaviorism and compliance-driven approaches and why we need to move away from those. So I won't spend a ton of time talking about that, but I think it's really important that we look at where functional behavioral assessments came from. I'm not sure I knew that they were rooted in applied behavioral analysis and behaviorism, 5-6 years ago. I'm not sure I knew that. And so I think we need to start at that piece. And then, so what? Why are we discussing this? Why are we trying to move forward and shift what we know, the approach and how it used to be to embedding some of those topics that we know more about that you discussed, neurodiversity and trauma sensitive lens. And in doing that, there's a specific impact and there's an importance as to why we need to be thinking about those. And then now what, I am a big believer of not just talking about philosophy. I want to make sure I give you some practical ways to align your practice to what we currently know and what our current knowledge is. So that's always important to me. So we'll talk about that. So before we continue, I do want you guys just to share out. I really like interactive trainings and conversations. So share out what your teams are doing now to determine the root cause of behaviors in either students or children or even individuals if you work with the adult population. And then what are you currently struggling with as an individual? I know by last year, I could barely even spit out the word attention seeking anymore. That was a huge, the traditional functions was a huge struggle that I was struggling with. So if you guys wanted to just throw in the chat, what are some struggles you have as an individual, what you're currently doing now in your teams, that would be great.
Yeah, and I just want to encourage people, again, you feel free to put that in the chat. And from whatever perspective, Connie, I think you and I talked about it, but our audience here is pretty broad. We've got a lot of parents that are, part of our community. We have a lot of self-advocates, a lot of autistic self-advocates. We have, though, as well, educators, administrators, attorneys, all sorts of folks. So, feel free to even share from your vantage point,
Absolutely.
whether or not you're somebody that's implementing, kind of behavior, or kind of seeing these things put into place. And I'll take a quick minute just to mention we've got some people from all over the world again joining us today. Not too many, so don't be shy. But yeah, I
right before I come on, he tells me up
right.
to 8,000 people might view this. I'm like, that's not what I needed to hear right now.
Right. But we've got some people from Canada, from New Zealand, Fargo, North Dakota, Massachusetts, Tennessee, number of people, UK again, Texas, a number of autistic individuals joining us as well. So we've got a lot of people joining us. Let's go ahead now. We've got a couple of people commenting on what you mentioned. Pam Collins, we're using Mona's Iceberg polyvagal theory.
Good. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. I embed the polyvagal theory absolutely into what I'm going to talk about today.
That's great. And I know we're both huge fans of Mona as well.
Yes.
Let me see. I've got another one here. David says, struggling with delay in testing due to COVID, looking for proper placement after a severe injury at a placement. Oh, David, I'm really sorry to hear that. I know you've been part of our community for quite some time. I'm sorry to hear that that's where you are right now. Let's see. Tamika says the FBAs at my kiddos' schools have all been based on the functions of behavior. Yeah, pretty common experience. Really says shifting the system view of behavior. There's no such thing as a bad boy. Yep. And a lot of other people say things very similar. Okay. Marion says yes. Functions: gain, obtain, escape, avoid. And Marion's from Australia.
Welcome,
we've got
Marion.
a lot of people telling you what they're doing here.
It's a topic that we need to talk about. It can be very frustrating within the current system where we have.
Yeah. Let's see. Christina says my bosses assess the children they work with and get the teachers to change the environment to help the child. That's good. Addressing the environment. Or they get the kids extra breaks for sensory breaks or sensory activities. That's great. And here's another one here. Anna, we've used the ABC model, but we're trying to change our lens to see behavior through a polyvagal lens. This, my heart is warming every time I hear the word polyvagal. The biggest challenge is adults who believe in behaviorism. And of course, a lot of these methods are well entrenched, things that have been happening in schools for a long time. And I'm going to pull one more up here and then we'll let you continue on. Let's see. Chrissy says, helping teachers and administrators understand and receive the training to acquire the lens shift. That's really important. We are pushing hard here in Seattle. Great to hear. And I want to let you know, we also have somebody joining us today from Romania. And I don't know if it's the first time we've had somebody from Romania. I think we may have before, but so you are now an international, speaker.
Well, hello, Mira. I hope I'm saying your name right. Okay, so those were some of the same frustrations I was having and some of the same shifts I've made or I've tried to make. Again, I want to start out by saying anything you see today is a work in progress. We are in the process of creating online forms so that we can share it with more people. But again, we're at phase 1 of phase 3. And so I'm always trying to change my language and see make as many shifts as I possibly can. So, all right, switching tabs so I can change pages. So looking backward to move forward, original functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans are rooted in behaviorism and ABA. They're traced way back to the 1930s. And for those of you who have read the article I wrote for you, Guy, for your blog, you know, gosh, we haven't changed what we're doing in so long. And that is really, really shocking to me, especially in our educational systems, which, you know, we're constantly learning and growing and promoting continued growth and growth mindset. So trace back to the work of B.F. Skinner in the 30s, behaviors were defined as observable responses to external stimuli. Just that simple stimuli response reaction changed through operant conditioning, which really gives us 4 types of reinforcement or punishment: positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative reinforcement, or negative punishment. And what ultimately that comes down to is this belief that behaviors are working for the child to attain, and you know, the following functions: to either attain or seek attention, to escape or avoid something, and tangible. I don't know how many times I've said tangible to a classroom teacher or to a parent, and then they just look at me with this blank look on their face, because sometimes I even think, you know, these traditional methods aren't even speaking the same language we speak about now. And so that can make this process really cumbersome for our families and our parents and our teachers even. And so tangible, just that you're being reinforced by something, some sort of item. Sensory, sometimes you'll see sensory regulation or sensory reinforcement. And then later on, a couple decades later, need for control got thrown in there also as a function. But the main 4, I would say, traditional functions are attention seeking, escape, avoid, tangible, or sensory. And there's a lot of people, and you know, we're working really hard. There's so many people working so hard to shift this lens away from behaviorism and away from applied behavioral analysis. Guy and I joked around about, you know, back 20 years ago in my CFY, I was a speech pathologist and I wrote a letter of complaint about ABA. And I'm surprised I didn't get fired, because, you know, 20 years ago, nobody was talking negatively about applied behavioral analysis. And I remember being shoved by a parent at a conference. I remember being like yelled at by my bosses. Like, what was I thinking? It was affecting the practice. So, but now we're talking about it, which is so exciting. And we're trying to shift away from that. And so I think a lot of people in the field are saying, why don't we just get rid of functional behavioral assessments? You know, why do we even have to do them? But we have to remember that they're rooted in IDEA. They're rooted in the Individuals with Disabilities Act. That all students with disabilities must have an evaluation that includes all areas of their disability, including behavior. So, you know, whether we call it a functional behavioral assessment or not, we need to be evaluating behavior if behavior is an area of concern. And then functional behavioral assessments are required for students with disabilities as a part of a manifestation determination. So unless that FBA was conducted prior to the placement change for disciplinary reasons. So in those instances, it's written in federal law, but I've been doing more and more research on state laws even. And because actually last year I was debating whether to get rid of functions or reframe functions, but functions are actually written into some state laws. I can't remember the exact state. I want to say California. You have to determine a function of the behavior. So I've really worked to reframe what function means and reframe the language. But Florida has a requirement of an FBA for eligibility of emotional disability when it comes to special education eligibility. Minnesota has the same for emotional disability, and it's one of the options for autism eligibility. And then Wisconsin, it's written into our restraint and seclusion law that the second time restraint and seclusion occurs within the same school year, that an FBA be conducted on the behavior of concern if it hasn't already. So we have a lot of barriers to getting rid of them.
Yeah, and wouldn't you say that, I mean, to some degree, in a perfect world, you know, the focus on behavior is a focus that I would love to see moved away from more, meaning that when we begin to appropriately accommodate kids and meet their needs and make sure that they feel safe, and behavior is the downstream. You know, it's the because of this, but very often the problem, I guess, here is that the lens of behavior puts all the blame on the child,
Absolutely.
rather than kind of focusing on what could have been done to better meet those child's needs. I mean, when I talk about restraint seclusion, one of the things I often say is that when I see a child that's being restrained and secluded, what I see is a child that's not having their needs appropriately met. That's the outcome. So, I hear you, and you and I had a couple of conversations about this whole idea, like FBA. I mean, it just, does that even need to exist? But the truth is there's, and this is what I'm so excited about your work, is that kind of the reframing that certainly if you need to figure out how to better support someone, there's a process that should be gone through to understand what their needs are. And really, I think that's what your work is really all about, is like, how do we understand needs and then better meet needs, which is the question we should be asking in the first place, right?
Absolutely. And it's so hard for me because it's been so long since thank you for bringing that up, because it's been so long since I've used a traditional FBA or a traditional, a behavior intervention plan rooted in, those traditional beliefs, that I forget that the focus can be on, the student,
Right.
and the student is to blame. Because in my eyes, the majority of what we're doing is trying to evaluate the environment and determine what additional supports need to be put in place, or make sure we're creating an environment that's welcoming to everybody's needs and their individual differences. And so,
Yeah, and environment's such an important word. I remember
Mhm.
we had Greg Santucci on once, and we're great discussion. He did a great presentation, but this whole thought, as I was listening to what he was saying, was, we shouldn't be assessing kids; we should be assessing environments.
Absolutely.
But again, that's
Mhm.
part of kind of where you're coming from too. So I will
Absolutely.
be quiet and let you roll on with it.
Well, and I'm a pretty optimistic person. And would I love for all of our educational environments to be at a place where we're meeting the needs of all learners at all times? I absolutely would. And that is 100% my goal. But I just don't know if we're there yet, especially right now with COVID and all the stressors on our educational system. And we have teachers leaving the field at unprecedented amounts. And so, a lot of the teachers that I'm even consulting with, they don't have a license for what they're teaching at this point in time. So while I'm optimistic, we're not there yet. So hopefully a good assessment can help us evaluate that environment and figure out what more supports a student needs. Okay, and then best practice, really, if we're thinking about an assessment as a way to understand the root cause of behaviors, what supports, what accommodations, what modifications, what potential interventions are going to help a student, if that's done correctly, it can help us, get to a deeper understanding of what's getting in the student's way, and a deeper understanding throughout the process. My goal is always throughout the process to be educating other people, educating staff, educating families, educating whomever is supporting that individual on this lens shift and how to think about behavior in a different way. And a good assessment can do that when we do it like in a really comprehensive manner. All right. So looking back to moving forward, we want to move away from behaviorism, which is that theory that human behavior can be explained in terms of operant conditioning, it doesn't have to do with the thoughts, the feelings, the sensations that a person is having. And that if somebody does have a disability or a psychological disorder, that we need to change them. We need to change their behavioral patterns. We want to move away from that. And I know your audience knows that a lot. We just know too much about the brain now. We've learned way too much to be continually using these approaches that are rooted in behaviorism. We have too much research telling us that rewards and consequences don't change behavior over the long term. And then moving away from compliance-driven models. And those are so dangerous for so many different reasons. But one of the biggest reasons, and one of the biggest issues that concern me about compliance-driven models, is that it teaches students, or it teaches other people, to ignore what their body is telling them in order to please another person or to get a reinforcer. I always tell this story. My daughter, she's only 8, but she developed a condition that causes her to faint more often, called dysautonomia. The most common form is POTS. She also has migraines and cyclic vomiting syndrome that started when she was in infancy. So when she started school, we developed a health plan, regular education accommodation plan. And I actually had to write it into her 504 plan that she can take her coat off when she's outside if she overheats, because overheating is one of her triggers to fainting. and I just think it's so like, I just sat back at that meeting and thought, why in the world do I even have to write this accommodation for my daughter? Because it's a rule of the school. If you go out with a jacket, you keep your jacket on. And those what that teaches children is not to listen to their sensations, not to listen to their body, not to trust what their body is saying, or if their body, not even to listen to it, because they have to make somebody else happy and follow someone else's rule. I oftentimes wonder, my goodness, did all of us have this nice, strong sense of understanding our body and trusting our gut instinct and trusting our sensations? And did this compliance-driven system that we entered, did that like smash it out of us? I don't know. I don't know, because there's so many adults that aren't aware of their own sensations. There's so many adults that don't, trust that. I'm one of them. I don't trust my gut instincts enough. And sometimes I wonder if these compliance-driven models did that to us. And so, for my daughter, I'm always stressing she needs to know her body. She needs to be aware of her sensations, and she needs to make adjustments based on what her body is telling her, so she doesn't pass out or get sick. And so that's, to me, is one of the biggest concerns that I have with compliance-driven models, that we're asking people not to trust what their body is telling them in order to please someone else. So, not to mention, I observed a little boy who had trouble focusing at a math lesson, and he was doodling on the whiteboard. And, I don't know what these arbitrary conditions were where he earned $1 and he lost $1, but throughout the whole lesson, the teacher was, giving him $1 for good behavior, taking $1 away for like inappropriate behavior. Again, it was completely inconsistent. Another difficulty with these rewards and punishment systems. It's hard to be consistent in those, and they don't oftentimes make sense. But he didn't learn anything from that. I watched an entire mini lesson in math, and there was no learning that took place for him. Right. If we could have just simply said to him, hey, we're about to do a lesson. What does your body need to help you focus and learn right now? And then helped brainstorm that with him. Or it seems like drawing helps you listen. Let's give you a dry erase board, and then afterwards check in with him and have that child self-reflect. Did that help you listen? Did that distract you? How did that work for you in your learning environment?
Yeah, Connie, I know we're probably both big fans of Dr. Afi Cohen's work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about punish by reward. And the fact is that we often think about compliance driven models in terms of that consequences or negative reinforcement can be a really bad thing. But people often then think that, well, rewards are a good thing. And unfortunately, I think as Alfie would share in his work, that the net result is the same. A reward and a consequence are really the same thing. It's a way of saying, if you do this, or I will either give you this or this will happen to you. And there's a lot of harm there. And I mean, I think about my own family's experience, and probably some of the most difficult days my son had in school programs evolved around reward systems. And when he suddenly didn't get a reward that he had worked really hard for and felt that he had earned, even though something may have happened that it was taken away for, the net result, I've seen more power struggles that have resulted in escalated situations, that have resulted in restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, all these other things, due to these compliance-driven models, due to these reward, and again, sometimes very well-intentioned reward and consequence models. They're really not helping the kids that often really need the help the most.
Absolutely. And oftentimes if you don't have a skill, we could reward that behavior all we want, and it's not going to change anything. Oftentimes I see it backfire even, and cause, like you said, cause more distress in that student, cause more anxiety, because they're trying to earn it and they can't. Or again, they're so arbitrary. There's these arbitrary conditions. Like, I worked really, really hard for half the day, and then I did something wrong, and now I can't get my reward. So, I see the exact same thing. I see the same thing. So, all right. Any other questions, Guy?
Let me just take a look here while you're switching slides. I've got a couple of comments here. I did see a question a second ago. This was from David. David says, what do we do about states and schools who won't change and have no regulations, like Massachusetts? I think it's the Department of Education bounds to the school and not the students. Any thought there in terms of advocating for change? How do you have, I know that a lot of your work's around consulting, but Do you have any thoughts on how parents or others might advocate for a change in the system?
So I've just learned a lot over the years about really building relationships with people, getting to know them, listening to their perspective, and realizing that change takes time. Gosh, I wish we could change things overnight, but it's really, really hard to. And for some reason, I've always been one who likes to change and like wants to grow and learn. But the majority of people, change is very hard for, and
Mhm.
so we really need to take baby steps. And I pick and choose my battles very, very intentionally.
Mhm.
I constantly have in my back of my head, this is a long-term goal, this is a short-term goal, and I try to move people along with me, because if I move too fast, oftentimes I will lose them
Sure.
completely, and that's not
Sure.
that's not going to do the students, that's not going to do our kids any good if that's what
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah,
So.
and part of that collaboration sometimes is sharing. It might be sharing a book. It might be sharing this
Mhm,
presentation.
mhm,
If you have an ally at the school. And David, I'll also say to you that I know a really amazing group of folks in Massachusetts that have actually been meeting with the Department of Education there and trying to influence some change. And if you would like to shoot me an email, I would be happy to connect you. There's always ways to influence change. I can't tell you how many copies of Ross Green's book I've given out, or Mona's book. Certainly some things that we can do on that collaborative side. And of course, the other side of that is legislative. Sometimes it
mhm.
means advocating for legislative changes in states that aren't moving in the right direction. Probably outside of the scope of what we can get into today. But yeah, good question for sure.
Well,
Uh,
and I oftentimes, and I mean, I don't think if I share some pages of my functional behavioral assessment or my behavior assessment and my support plan, I embed quotes, a lot of quotes into what I do, because sometimes there's not a lot of time for people to read a book. There's not a lot of time for people to go to a training. But if I can, as I'm going through this process, share snippets that makes people like perspective change a little bit, that's my ultimate goal. Well, it
mhm,
makes it makes the forms a little bit longer, which is a downfall. It helps with my long-term goal of shifting that perspective. And so, and
mhm, mhm.
especially, we have so many quotes from people who, are neurodivergent and have lived this experience. And if we
Mhm,
listen to them more and more, hopefully we can shift that
mhm.
perspective even more. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll let
Okay.
you go ahead and
Okay.
continue on.
And so if we take this traditional approach to FBAs and behavior intervention plans, basically it starts with that belief that behavior is working for the student, that belief that the behavior is intentional. If we think the behavior is working for the student, the ultimate end result is that we think the behavior is intentional. And when we think a student's behavior or a child's behavior is intentional, that decreases our understanding and it decreases our patience. And then that outcome, if we think the behavior is working for them, if we think it's intentional, if we've lost our patience because of that and we don't have much understanding, then we're going to use these approaches that are planned ignoring. They're withholding attention when our children need the attention the most. Gosh, even as a parent, I felt so like judged for supporting my daughter through difficult moments and when she was crying and having meltdowns versus withholding attention. People just, even the shift in parenting is just now coming around. And so we are going to reward and provide incentives for compliance. We're going to punish for non-compliance, or provide incentives for desired behaviors. And the ultimate outcome then is going to be strained relationships, frustrated adults, and stressed out students, which is only going to make behaviors more frequent um, and prevalent. So, where do we want to go? Where do we want to move forward? We want to embrace the relationship driven approach. And I mean, we have learned so much about the power of relationships, how our nervous system is both shaped and regulated through interactions with others. Now we understand that children aren't going to automatically self-regulate, that's not even developmentally appropriate, that multiple opportunities of co-regulation is going to lead to that independence. And well, sometimes I even wonder if self-regulation exists. As an adult, I am reliant on the people around me to help me regulate all the time. I know I have heard from introverts that say, no, self-regulation can't exist. But I still, in my age, rely on other people to help regulate myself and my relationships with other people. So that we know that now. And we know every time we jump in and help our students or our children move from dysregulation to regulation, we're helping build that neurological pathway of calm. And that's the ultimate goal. And so we also know more and more about neuroscience. Several of you guys brought up the polyvagal theory, but we know that that a lot of these behaviors are bottom-up behaviors, that our brains are constantly scanning the environment for, whether we're safe or whether we're in danger. And we're looking for those cues all the time at a subconscious level. It's not conscious. And if we feel like we're in threat, our adaptive responses that are there to help protect us are going to kick in. And that could look like somebody fighting. That could look like somebody freezing. That could look like somebody fleeing and leaving and running and escaping. And so during those moments of distress, our autonomic nervous system takes over. And we know that now. It's not conscious at a subconscious level. And now that we know better, we can kind of change the way we address that. And then on top of that, we have a lot of people in this world who have hypervigilant neuroception of threat. Their brain is on a higher alert. That could be because of trauma. That could be because of sensory differences. My own daughter is hypervigilant because of her medical trauma and just because she started getting migraines as an infant, and those were chronic. They were unpredictable. They happened out of the blue. That's the definition of trauma. We didn't know what they were until she was 2. And so she herself has more of a hypervigilant state. She's always scanning her environment and whether or not it's safe, or, she doesn't know that, but at a subconscious level, she is doing that more than other people. And so now that we know more about neuroscience, we need to be moving our processes and our assessment towards, using what we know about that. And then we need to really be trauma sensitive in what we do. I think one of the biggest ways to be trauma sensitive is remove punishment and rewards. Acknowledge that a lot of our students have hypervigilant neuroceptions of threat because of what they've experienced at a younger age. That area of the brain is even larger in some of our students who have experienced trauma at a young age, in particularly. And then realizing and understanding that for neurodivergent individuals, that they have a lot of traumatizing aspects to their lives. That could be sensory trauma, just from living in a world that doesn't meet their sensory needs. It could be social trauma. It could be communicative trauma. I've seen a lot of students that I've supported who, even once we've got a good system in place to help them speak if they were non-speaking, they still have those carried experiences with them of years of people not understanding them. So we have to be really explicit in letting them know that we understand them. Even when they're using, a system to communicate in a more conventional way, we still have to reassure them and let them know that we've understood them, because they have so many past experiences of people not understanding them. So we really need to be listening to that neurodivergent voice and what their lived experiences are telling us, which kind of goes into neurodiversity approaches. And just, we need to move away from thinking that we all learn the same and that we all act the same, and realizing that all of our brains are different, and developing environments that are accepting and welcoming for neurodivergent learners and for all of our learners. That what might work for me to focus and attend isn't gonna work for you, Guy. You might need something totally different, and that's okay. And that's something we need to build our environments around. Getting rid of this whole body listening, that we all have to sit still and be quiet and look at the listener to be able to be attending.
I just brought up a quick comment from someone who mentioned that the brains are also not fully developed, which I think is a great point. There's this expectation at times that children are miniature adults with fully developed brains, and that's just simply not true. Whether and we know so much about the brain development, but Mona I think puts it really well when she talks about having expectations of kids that they're really not that are not neurodevelopmentally appropriate. And that often happens is that, again, we have these expectations when, again, children do not have fully developed brains.
Yes, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but I often use No Drama Discipline Workbook by Tina Payne Bryson and Dan Siegel. I love all Dr. Mona's work, but I love their work also. But it talks about, and it has you actually self-rate. It talks about, that feelings portion of the brain is fully developed at birth, and the thinking portion of the brain isn't fully developed until, upper 20s, 30s. I think they're even suspecting early 30s now. And so, of course, our students are going to flip their lid more. Our younger children are going to flip their lids more, because that area of the brain that's responsible for those protective fight instincts, that's fully developed, where the thinking brain isn't. And what I love about that no drama discipline checklist, it has you self-rate some of those thinking brain skills and what you expect from your child. And maybe it's our expectations. We're expecting too much, and maybe that's what a big part of the problem is. So wholeheartedly agree. Okay, so what? Why do we even have to talk about the belief system? Anytime I do a training, even when I'm doing a training on how to assess student behavior, I start with belief, because our belief really starts everything. And so our explanation guides our intervention, and how we respond to behavior depends completely on what we think is causing it. And so, this is somewhat of a modified Pygmalion effect diagram about behavior, but whether it's staff or family, or support system, their beliefs and their behavior philosophy, that's where it all starts. And that leads to our expectation of our students or child. And then that leads to our perspective of the behavior and our language. And I'm going to show you a video later today that our language actually changes our thinking, the language that we use. We've said for so long our language matters, and now there's evidence to show that our language changes our thinking, and then our thoughts and our feelings and our nervous states all are impacted by that language that we use and those belief systems. And that's what leads to our response, which leads to our students' experience and their view of themselves, and then their thoughts, their feelings, their nervous system states, which ultimately the last outcome is the students' actions. So by no means is this behavior on our students. Behavior does not happen in a vacuum. Absolutely not. It is a connected experience between the person who's responding to the behavior, the environment, the belief systems that underlay what the people in the environment are believing in, and their philosophy. It's much bigger than just looking at a student's behavior. Okay, so I want to get into some ways to turn philosophy into practice. And in my article, I kind of gave you 3 ways, 3 major shifts that we need to make when we're assessing behavior, but I've ended today with 5 major shifts. So I will jump into those if there aren't any questions, Guy.
No, go ahead on.
Okay.
And we'll, and I do want to remind folks that as we're going through this, if you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat.
Okay, so shift 1 is really we need to redefine behavior. And I love Dr. Mona Delahooke's definition of behavior, that it's both a response to external and internal stimuli. I'm not saying that the environment and external stimuli isn't important. It absolutely is. But we also have to know that it goes much deeper than that. It goes much deeper than what we see. And it's about our students' sensations, their feelings, their thoughts also. And those are going to influence behaviors. And so definitely need to start with shifting our definition of behavior. In my functional behavioral assessment, or my behavioral assessment, the first page is definitions. And I've defined behavior as, external responses to both, observable responses to both, what is happening on the outside and what's happening inside in our students. So we also have to realize that if we can change our definition of behaviors to move away from just observable ideas. And somebody had mentioned Dr. Mona Delahooke's iceberg analogy. And I used to use the iceberg analogy. I love the iceberg analogy, but I've also kind of moved into this root cause analysis. And so what we see is only, the tip. It's only what we see above the surface. And there's always root causes that we need to dig deeper and try to determine what's going on. And so stressors, that could be, and I've defined stressors. I've made it much, much more broad, in that it could be situations, events, environments, sensations, thoughts, emotions, or people that decrease our students' window of tolerance. And then triggers are going to be those same things that data has told us. We need to rely on our data here and our observations and our interviews. What predictively activates that student's wave of distress or that student's cycle of distress, and what activates that distress cycle in our students. And somebody had mentioned in the comments the ABC approach, and there's a lot of talk about, and I think about this often, what could be a stressor one day might be a trigger the next. I think about stressors as, medication changes or, a history of trauma. Guy, you brought that up to me earlier today. A history of trauma could be, a stressor. It could over time, that is causing somebody's window of tolerance to be less. But I still think it's really important in this process to make behaviors as predictable as possible to the adults in the environment too. And when we talk about this wave of distress, we have to remember that whomever is supporting a student, they're going through that same process. And depending on their experience and their knowledge, hopefully it's just not going to be as steep of a wave or as high of a wave as the students. But if we can make it more predictable for the adults around them, then we can decrease the adults' anxiety. And if we decrease our anxiety, we're more likely to respond in supportive ways. And so I've debated whether or not to just lump stressors and triggers together, because, a trigger for me is whining, and that might not be a trigger on a day I'm well rested. I've had a good meal. I've had all my needs met socially, and I feel safe in my environment. That might not be a trigger on that day, but I still think we need to try and make the behavior as predictable as possible. So I've kind of left that in there. And then when I say a root cause of behavior could be neurodivergent characteristics, what I mean by that, in no way, shape, or form am I saying that neurodivergent characteristics cause behavior. But what I'm saying is we have to dig into the environment and look at whether the environment is accepting, supporting, and welcoming of those neurodivergent needs. Because if it's a really rigid, inflexible environment, then what could happen is behaviors as an outcome. A good example, I was just conducting an assessment on a student, and he was autistic, and he very, very much liked to watch who came out of the staff bathroom. And so all these behaviors were occurring because everybody was trying to make him move on. Like, you can't stand outside of the bathroom, that's inappropriate, like, I'm trying to get him to move on. Where when I came in and did my observation, I just said, why is this such a big deal? Let's accept it. Let's welcome it. Let's use it. Let's use it to, let's put it was a very, very small building. Let's put pictures of staff. I mean, they're going into a public bathroom. You don't get privacy when you go into a public bathroom. When you walk out, everybody's going to see you who's standing in line. There's usually lines to public restrooms. So let's just let him make tally marks on how many people went to the bathroom, or sort by staff who went to the bathroom. And we can use it to teach math. Let's embrace it. Let's use his interest to teach. And lo and behold, when we made that shift, a lot of our behaviors went away. And so we have to be more accepting and welcoming of some of these differences and individual differences that we all come to the table with. And
do you mind if I just add something in there? I was just thinking as you said that, and I think about my son. I have an amazing son, and he's autistic, and one of the things that sometimes he can be a little inflexible. Sometimes he can have very black and white thinking. Of course, I can as well. But if you take someone that has that inflexibility and kind of that black and white thinking, and as an adult, your response is to be inflexible, what's going to happen? You engage in these power struggles where needlessly behaviors arise because of the power struggle. You mentioned earlier kind of the adult stress and triggers as well. And, kind of going back to what David said earlier and kind of what you said earlier, of course, the difference in part is that we have skills that sometimes the children don't have. We have a brain that's, fully developed where the children's aren't. But I think that's such an important point about kind of understanding and recognizing things that may be characteristics that we might see in individuals, and how often they're just not really even recognized, much less valued, because some of the characteristics can as you mentioned, it's like, hey, let's turn this into a strength.
Absolutely.
So anyway, just wanted to share that.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes I think that, I mean, no ill intent by the staff members. They were thinking that they needed to get him ready for the real world, and show him what we have to be like. And I'm like, why though? Sometimes it's just that different perspective. I'm like, anytime you go into a public restroom, there's typically a line outside. You're not provided this privacy that you entered into a bathroom and came out of it. Like, I'm not saying let them go to the door and open it, but I mean, like, usually when you enter a public restroom, you're going to have somebody's going to see you go in and someone's going to see you go out. And so I think we just have to also remind everybody that sometimes schools can be the most inflexible place in the world. Like, when we leave school, we can make a life that works for us, and we can go into a profession that works for us. And I know in the state of Wisconsin, our Department of Public Instruction have surveyed people who have been in special education and asked about, do they get more accommodations in school and modifications in school settings or in their work environment? And, keeps coming back that it's the work environment is much more flexible. And so we have to let people know that and shift that thought process, because I mean, especially some of our paraprofessionals and our educational assistants, they think they're doing the right thing. Ross Green always says kids do well if they can. And I always try to remind myself, people, teachers, adults do the best that they can too. And so sometimes this is just shifting that perspective and teaching the adults also. So we also want to go into the response to behavior. I said this before, behavior does not happen in a vacuum, and we have to be aware of the way we respond. That is going to have a direct impact on our students. So while in a traditional behavioral assessment, we used to look at consequences, and I think that word made us think of punishment. I have always used that word to look at what's going on in the environment. Are more supports being provided now that should have maybe been provided before? What's happening in the environment? How is the adult responding? Are they giving a lot of verbal cues where that thinking brain has gone offline and they can no longer understand that? What the staff is saying, do we need to use more visuals? So we need to be looking at how we're responding to behaviors also. And then, looking at if there's any skills that maybe need to be beefed up, or is there an area of growth the student needs are there any lagging skills that could be contributing to the behavior? And if so, what can we do to help support that growth? And not that I'm saying we need to change a person, but sometimes, we all have areas that we can grow in, and perhaps there's some area that we can grow in that can help decrease some of those behaviors. And then functions, but I'll talk about functions later, because I have definitely reframed how we think about functions. And Guy, my daughter's just joining a class. Can you hear her in the background? Can you hear her?
Sorry, I disappeared. I went to mute and made myself disappear. So I was just leaving you alone just to.
No, that's okay. My daughter just started a class. Can you hear her in the background?
We can a little bit. It's fine. We can hear you mainly. So
okay, good.
You're fine.
I can make her leave, but that hypervigilant brain she has, she doesn't like to be out of my sight. So she doesn't feel safe. Okay. So I have also, when we think about behavior as more than just what we see, we can add that neurological aspect to it and what we know about neuroscience. And so this is how I kind of like to explain it to staff and to parents. And I've just coined it the wave of distress. I've changed it to behavior, because really what's happening to that student is they're under distress, or they're under stress. And so there is always a warning. I know a lot of people think that a student can go from 0 to 10 in 10 seconds, and it might be 10 seconds, but if we watch really closely and we use our keen observational skills, we can really map out how a student looks as they start to move into that adaptive protection. And so we'll get into that a little bit more later, but the neurological aspect of this is that when we're safe, when we're secure, and we find our safety in relationships and predictability, then our thinking brain is fully online. And our thinking brain is that upstairs prefrontal cortex that allows us to be emotionally regulated. It helps us have control over what we're doing. It helps us feel organized and stay organized and rational and have logical thoughts and understand abstract language, be empathetic, be flexible, be solution oriented. Those are all thinking brain skills. As soon as that trigger occurs, our thinking brain starts to go offline. And as we move up this wave of distress, our feeling brain starts taking over. And that part of the brain is survival focused. It's feeling driven. It's where the fight, flight, freeze system happens. We become more illogical. We become more concrete. We become more disconnected. And part of what moves us into action to protect ourselves is that vagal nerve. And when people mention the polyvagal theory, this is a portion, this is what it's talking about, is that the vagus nerve, which is the longest cranial nerve in our body, it connects the brain to all the major organs. And that there's a vagal brake, which is the pathway that supports our ability to move from action to calm and adaptive action to protect ourselves. And that's why I've labeled the top of this wave as protection, because this is an adaptive response to protect ourselves. We don't want that to go away. There shouldn't be shame to that. I mean, that's going to help us survive if we're walking down an alley, then it's dark and somebody starts trailing behind us. And so that vagal brake releases, and the student moves from unease to disconnection to protection. And then as we can provide safety and co-regulation and supports, the vagal brake will re-engage, and then the student goes through rest and restore, and then they ultimately recover. But it's really important for us all also to know that when they're recovering, all those chemicals and hormones that get, activated in our brain and our body, those can be running through your system for up to 4 hours after an incident. And so it's really important for us to know that. It's called the amygdala hijack hangover, so that we can adapt our environment and we can adapt our expectations for that student if they've gone through this wave of distress, because they might be more easily re-triggered if they're still in that recovery stage. I mean, we've written into plans, okay, they're going to repair the rupture that happened after this, but that's not going to happen for at least 4 hours after. Those are individual decisions that a team needs to make based on the child. Some children can never repair because it just re-triggers them right away. But we need to be making those as individual team members. So hopefully, if we can map this out, the whole goal of this is if we can map out what a student might look like in unease, like let's say, and I always joke around that my old boss, her neck would get red when she started to get triggered. And that's when I'd be like, all right, guys, we got, Erin's neck gets red when she gets stressed. We got to end the meeting, like end it now. As soon as you see that red neck, because things are not going to go well after that. So, maybe a student in unease, their ears get red or their face gets a little red. That can be a sign of, your blood pressure increasing, which is really nice for some of our students who are non-speaking. We can watch them closely. And if they can't tell us, we can pick up on some of these subtle signs. And that's when we want to provide our supports as quickly as possible, because that's when we're going to make the biggest difference. So it's really important to map this out and understand the neurology behind it.
Hey, Connie, I just was going to bring up a quick comment here, and this really went back to probably a little bit prior, but Christina shared that I got more adjustments in work than in school. I only had extra time for exams. In work, I had no lights on above me in the office. I have headphones to block noise out and a sensory area if I need it. And that goes back to what you were saying about environments and the schools sometimes being the, one of the least accommodating sometimes, even though really we often have some kids that really need these accommodations. I think back, and I'm probably not the only one that ever heard this in an IEP meeting, but something along the effects of like, kind of, we're doing this so that how are they going to be in the real world? What if they go into a store? I mean, it's amazing, kind of the things that people would bring up to kind of justify not meeting a kid's needs. And I think Christina's point is good as well, that that real world, you actually have a lot more control over the choices that you make, and advocating for yourself. And of course, there are laws in place and people that are supportive. But I think again, putting someone through hardship intentionally to somehow toughen them up to the real world is not the answer. I mean, that of course leads to distress. That of course leads to, potentially an escalation that can lead to fight or flight, that can lead to, restraint, seclusion, and so many other things. So, I think making that change and that lens change that you talk about is so important. Even again, though, recognizing that sometimes the intentions are, to somehow be helpful, or based on how people have been taught to respond. But if it doesn't make sense, if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. And people should think about that. So anyway, I was just excited to see that comment shared. I don't know if you have any more comments on that.
Yeah. No, I wholeheartedly agree. And I don't know. I mean, we see this in early childhood too. Like sometimes sometimes the younger a child is, we put more expectations on them because we have to get them ready for kindergarten, or we have to get them ready for middle school.
Mhm,
And that's just not the way it is. And so I
mhm,
think we need to really be shifting that perspective and talking about that. And
mhm, mhm. Yeah,
um,
yeah,
mhm.
and Christina made the point again that what child or teen knows what adjustments they need. And that's why I think, much of what you're doing in the approach that you're taking is trying to get at understanding what that is. But very often, again, when we're attributing blame, which is really what the current accepted FPA is all about, is, well, it was one of these four functions, and this is why the child did what they did, rather than really trying to understand why is something happening. Because, Christina, again, that represents a failure to understand. I mean, you know staff and others should be working to understand what a child needs. A child might not always know, but
Right.
certainly a good place is to ask. And you mentioned something about this before, I think, when we talked about kind of, the kinds of questions that you might ask to kind of understand, what might be, getting in someone's way. Anyway, I just thought that was a really interesting point.
Yes, and I think that's where self-reflection comes into play too. Like if we're going to be trying supports, and if we're going to be trying like even if it comes to deep breathing, or if it comes to a standing desk, or fidgets, we need to be always bringing that back to our students and our children and saying, how'd that work for you? Do you think that helped you? Do you think that hurt you? Do you think that helped you, listen and focus, or do you think it distracted you? We need to be involving them if they're able in those discussions to be able to um, have them start thinking about that so they can
Yeah.
learn. I mean, the ultimate goal is that they can learn what they need to suctry and what
Yeah, and
they don't
ultimately
need.
advocate for that as well.
Mhm,
Again,
mhm,
one of my biggest criticisms with the kind of widely accepted approach to doing a functional behavioral assessment is the biggest missing thing from the equation is the child. It begins with kind of assigning, kind of deciding what you think the antecedent was, looking at what the behavior is, and then coming up with a plan. But even in coming up with that plan, the child's not involved. So to me, that's a critical flaw. You can't, if we're trying to solve the problems that are affecting somebody's life, we need to involve them. And I think that holds true of kids as well. And that's one of, I think, the greatest flaws with a lot of the methodology is it's about adult hypothesis and then
mhm.
hypothesized solution, where there are a lot of clues out there, and one of them is about having whatever communication we can with, a child, and understanding what their needs are.
Mhm. I have some examples of that coming up.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember when that was, but yes, absolutely. I'm hoping it's the next one because yes, it is. Look at you. You led me right into it. And so absolutely 100% agree. And I think that might be one of the things I've learned the most as I've started to do these assessments more and more is we have to have our students' input. We have to. I can honestly say I don't think I used to interview the student in my, back when I was still in the school districts conducting FBAs. And that's probably been one of the biggest helpful pieces that I've had is involving the students in those conversations and talking to them about it. And that kind of goes to Brene Brown's quote, like in order to empathize with someone's experience, you must be willing to believe them as they see it, not as how you imagine their experience to
Mhm.
be. So, when I say shift two is for us to understand what experiences will influence behavior for the long term and not what consequences are going to stop the behavior right now, we have to start with getting the student's perspective of that
Mhm.
experience.
Mhm.
Because if we don't, all of our interventions or all of our plans and all of our supports and all of our environmental modifications could be for naught because we could have the absolute wrong hypothesis, like you said.
Mhm.
So, like a quick story, about a month ago, I was observing a kindergarten boy, and he was, I could see him getting distressed, and he was, going through some unease behaviors and moving up to disconnection. And I got to the point, they were doing free play. the whistle blew or the timer blew and they all had to clean up. And that's what the trigger was, the cleanup time. And planned ignoring kicked in. And so this student, went through the entire wave of distress where he all of a sudden was in fight flight, and he was throwing things all over the room. He was like knocking over tables. He was, having some pretty big emotions and behaviors. And after we got him calm and regulated again, I asked him, what was it that made you upset with cleanup time? Here I had written it down on my pad of paper, we need to do more foreshadowing. Maybe we need to do verbal foreshadowing versus visual foreshadowing versus verbal. I had like jotted down some ideas based on what I thought maybe the problem was, that he didn't want to be done playing. And he said to me, I was playing with the trucks and I wanted to be the one to pick up the trucks, but so-and-so picked them up for me and I wanted to do that. Well, thank goodness I asked him, because that wasn't in my thought process at all. I hadn't even occurred to me that this poor child just wanted to like clean up a little bit. He didn't want more playtime. He wanted to be the one who picked up the trucks because he's the one who was playing with them. And so thank goodness I asked him and I brought him into that conversation, because had I not, we could have made the best modifications and supports and they wouldn't have done anything for that situation, because we hadn't gotten his perspective of the experience. So absolutely 100% agree with you. And I can't take credit for this shift too. Dr. Lori, who you're going to have on next week, she writes about this in her book, Beyond, I always forget the name. Why? I don't know, but connection over compliance. Yeah. I wrote it down today because I always like spit it out. But, shifting that thought process from consequence to experience. So what consequence will end the behavior now is not where we want to be. And it's really a hard shift for us, especially if we're getting more and more distressed and anxious while we're watching behaviors, because when we get anxious, our thinking brain goes offline too, and we revert back to what we know. And a lot of us grew up with consequences. A lot of us went through the school system with that approach. Our parents, oh my gosh, I was grounded multiple times. My mom definitely, had punishments for me. And so, and what I think sometimes they get automatically reinforced because it stops the behavior momentarily. But what I try to tell people is, if you took data over time, your threat of consequence or your threat of punishment, that's not decreasing any behaviors. So sometimes I can threaten my daughter that something's going to be taken away and she'll stop momentarily, but it does not last. And so, hey, I've even done it. So we have to realize that we all, when we get stressed, go back to what we know, and we have to like take away that blame and that shame of that. That's just what happens when our thinking brain goes offline. But shifting that to what experiences are going to influence the behavior in the long term. And so, what consequences does Addison need when she throws items around the room, to shifting that to what experiences can I provide for her so that she feels and senses safety and connection in our classroom? Or if it's developmentally appropriate, what experiences does she need to help her calm down when she's upset? Is she old enough to learn some calming strategies on her own? What works for her? That could be one of our experiences that change behavior. But consequences aren't going to end it over the long term. What consequences does Emma need when she refuses to do her classwork? To what experiences does Emma need so that she can perceive that she is capable? And her perception is her reality. So she needs to perceive she's capable so she can do the work. What consequences does Lily need when she flees from the room? To what experiences does Lily need to develop a stronger neurological pathway to calm? And we're going to talk a little bit more about those neurological pathways and how we learn. Okay, so shift 3 is really showing up for our students. Let's get rid of this planned ignoring and this withdrawing attention when behaviors happen. As Tina Payne Bryson says, the difference between adversity making us fragile versus making us resilient is having someone show up and walk with us through it. We really need to remember that co-regulation leads to self-regulation over time. Multiple experiences of a caregiver showing up and helping a student move from dysregulation, or helping a child move from dysregulation to regulation. So rewards and punishment are not going to help a student regulate their emotions or their body states or their behaviors in the long term. Our brains are social organs. We're wired to connect. We need to, we have to have those experiences of co-regulation to be able to regulate in the long run. I could talk about this at length because I think planned ignoring is one of the most hurtful
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
messages we can send anybody.
mhm,
We're sending a message that you matter so little that I don't even have to respond to you. B, that our care and our concern for you is contingent on what we have coined as appropriate behavior, which is not a message that we want to send. And it also sends a message that not all feelings or nervous system states are okay. And that's a
mhm,
really bad message to send to people.
mhm.
I think we have learned so much about that
Yeah,
nowadays.
I've always liked the reframing, the say, instead of looking at it as a attention seeking, how about connection seeking? Kids need
Mhm.
connection. Kids rely on connection. Kids don't necessarily have the ability to regulate on their own, and really need to borrow the prefrontal cortex of a well-regulated adult to help them to regulate. I think about plan ignoring, and it's really upsetting to me. And even beyond that is, what we talk about, which is seclusion. Kids that are
Mhm.
dysregulated that get thrown into empty rooms, have the door held shut alone, dysregulated, and somehow are expected to calm when that in fact is really traumatic. So that connection, I think is really so critical. And again, recognizing their state of brain development and where they are and
Mhm.
why they need the help of a calm and well-regulated adult.
Absolutely. We just need to share our calm with them, not ignore
That's
them.
right. That's right.
Not ignore them. So I did a train the trainer workshop, and I will leave off the name of the approach, but but a district sent me there because they really wanted me to be the trainer, and I just couldn't stop because it was all about withdrawing attention as soon as
Mm,
behavior
mm.
occurs. And I was like this broken record. I think they wanted to kick me out because I just kept saying, this goes against what we know about the brain. This is not trauma sensitive. This is, like, there's no way I can support this approach at all. Not when that's one of the key components of it. So um, okay, so shift 4, I'm looking at our time and we're really behind time. I'm sorry. We're almost done. Shift 4 is that when we show up, we need to remember that our response to behavior is a connected experience between us and our students. What we do impacts our students, how we feel impacts our students or our child, and what we do impacts them. And then the same thing with the students. What they do, how they look, and how they feel impacts us. It's gonna cause, if we're not aware of that, we need to be aware of that what students do is that's impacting us also, and our autonomic nervous system states, our feelings, our emotions, our sensations. And by being aware of it, we can hopefully control it a little bit. And by making behaviors more predictable, which I hope to do through that wave of distress, that absolutely can help ease some of our own distress, because if we can make things more predictable, we will feel less anxious and distressed. But we have to be aware that our nonverbal body language is sending a message. Our eye gaze is sending a message, our posture, our tone, our pitch, our volume, everything that we're doing is impacting the student. And so same, especially for those children who have hypervigilant neuroception of threat, their brain is scanning those nonverbals even more so than all of us do, because they're really on alert for danger. And so we need to be aware of how we show up.
Hey, Connie, I just brought up
Mhm.
a comment here, and I think this actually relates to this, which is, kind of making the point here. What they say, have I heard? Um, they used to say it. They used to say, "I need to calm down," and then start doing what calmed them down. And I think this is very related here. That what calms us isn't necessarily what's calming to someone else. Certainly, I think that's why it takes a lot of different approaches, but it's making that connection between others. And certainly we have a lot of influence. And this is what always gets me about the classical approach, is this idea that we're putting it all on the child, when in fact so much of how we respond, the tone of voice we use, all of these things. And you mentioned your own journey, and I have my own as a dad, and learn things along the way. I wish I knew everything then that I know now.
I know, me
But
too.
we keep trying to learn and do better, right? But even just using the calm tone of voice, even just keeping myself regulated rather than flying off the. So anyway, I think it's really an interesting point that Christina brought up, that to that point, that also the things that calm you won't necessarily calm someone else.
And maybe what somebody was saying about to Christina too is there is, we all have mirror neurons. And, if I was to pick up my glass to take a drink of water without calling attention to it, you're more likely to do the same. Or if that's why yawns are contagious. I yawn, other people in the room might yawn. So there is something to be said with,
Right.
if I model deep breathing, maybe the student will start doing that, or humming can activate that vagus nerve and help you calm down. And so I might start humming around students, but I can't draw attention to it. If you draw attention to it, the mirror neurons don't work. So, so I might do some of that modeling. And again, what works for me might not work for them, but I use what I know about neuroscience also to kind of, try some different strategies to see if what I can do helps the student. But I don't bring attention to it, because if you bring attention to it, it's a moot point. It doesn't work.
Right. But again, the mirroring, this is really interesting, because the mirroring of calm. Okay. So if I'm yelling to someone to calm down and okay, well, try your deep breathing. Well, that's not going to have a positive effect, right?
No.
But this happens, right? I mean, how many times in the history of the world has telling someone to calm down worked? I know I've got my own tally list, and it hasn't worked well. So I mean, that's so important and connected to what you're saying, is that our own state, and kind of having a well-regulated state ourselves, is so critical to supporting and working with others.
Absolutely. I can't tell you how many times as a parent the day has just gone awful. And I realize it started with me because, I'm under a lot of stress. I have deadlines. I didn't get sleep very well. I didn't get a good night's sleep. And that affected my mood, which then again affected my daughters. So I do teach staff to, use self-talk and say, am I sending cues of danger or cues of safety? I have that right in my support plan. Like, we need to use a strategy in those moments, because if we don't, what the student does could impact us to cause us to behave in a way that's not going to be supportive of calming a student down. And another really simple strategy is to think of a time you were connected with that child, a positive time that you really felt connected, and that can almost shift that whole neurological experience environment. How there's a tone to when you walk into a room, you can kind of feel that emotional tone. And just by thinking of a time when you were connected with that child, you could shift that tone of the room, or of the wherever you may be. So you can shift the experience for everybody involved. All right. So the last shift, I have changed behavior, my language in my behavior intervention, in my assessment and my support plan, is I don't really talk about targeted behavior. I've gotten rid of that target behavior verbiage, and I've just moved to the wave of distress. I've done that for a couple of reasons. I absolutely want people to know that behavior is oftentimes a stress response. And if I use the word distress, that's more likely to send that message. I've also just never have I really observed or done an assessment on a student who has one behavior only. So when some of these people want us to target a behavior of concern, I'm like, but usually there's a wave that a student goes through as distress, and a lot of it has to do with the way we respond to the situation, but it also has to do with the levels of stress in that environment and the amount of triggers and stressors that student has had. But I guess I just haven't had a student who has had one behavior only that I can target. And plus I want to shift that thought process away from, we have to have a targeted behavior to address, to, hey, our student is going through some distress. How can we support them? And so that's the bigger piece. But so I've shifted that. I've sometimes, and I really have found that especially classroom teachers, they really, really appreciate this, and our assistants in our schools. Because I actually, in my forms, I have fillable boxes that can describe exactly what the student looks like in safe and secure, exactly what they look like in unease. And then another box next to it that says, how should the staff respond? And, the responses are all calming strategies and de-escalation strategies. Our goal when this happens is to bring that student back to safe and secure. If we can, I mean, we can't always do that, but if we can, that's our goal, because what we know about neuroplasticity, it tells us that the more we practice a behavior, the more patterned behavior, the more patterned something happens, the more likely it's to lead to automaticity. And so I want to interrupt this pattern, and I want to bring them back to safe and secure, so that I can teach them those pathways to calm, not those pathways to fight, fight, flight. I don't want those pathways to fight, fight, flight to get really strong and become automatic. And that's why prevention is so important too. That's why designing supports to be proactive and prevent as much as we can is important, because the more we can keep them in that safe and secure stage, the stronger those neurological pathways become. And we know this now because of everything we know about neuroplasticity, which I'm sure Dr. Lori is going to talk to you about, since it's the topic of her new book that she's writing. But that's one way. Teachers have been super grateful, because I've had outside experts sometimes come in, BCBAs, no offense to, like, I try not to judge a person based on their label, but I've had some BCBAs come in and say, we need to have a different plan for every targeted behavior, or we need to have a different plan for every function. And I kind of want to say, well, you've obviously never run a classroom of 25 people, because that is going to be impossible for a teacher to follow. And we need to remember that if we're putting a plan in place for a student who's in special education, that's a legally binding plan. So we better be doing what we're saying we're doing. I've also reframed the function of behaviors, and I really thought very, very heavily about whether to get rid of functions. But like I said, I wanted to research state law, and a lot of state laws, their functional behavioral assessment are tied to assigning a function. And so I decided to just reframe them. Plus, sometimes knowing the function can help me guide my observations and help guide, like, what I want to watch, and how I want to interview the staff, and what I want to talk to those students about. So I've just, instead of the traditional definition of function saying behavior has a specific function that reinforces the behavior so that it works to achieve some sort of, attention or escaping something, I've just defined it as the why behind behaviors. If we can think about functions as just the why behind behaviors, they become less bad. And so attention seeking becomes connection seeking, and a need for co-regulation. Escape, is that adaptive response to situations that cause distress. We are put in a situation that's really stressful, or we don't feel safe, and our adaptive response, which really is a trait to enhance survival, that kicks in, and we go into fight, flight, or we flee, basically, because this is escape that we're talking about. So we flee. Or the response to demands exceed somebody's ability. I mean, I always tell this story, like, I'm a perfectionist. So I delay doing laundry like crazy, because I have all these rules in my head on how I have to sort them. I don't want the colors to bleed. I want to make sure I get all the stains out. I've gotten a lot better through self-talk, but I avoid that situation like crazy, because I know how much work it's going to be for me to do it the way I want to do it. And so my husband could put a behavior chart in place and reward me for every time I do laundry. It would not work. So if the demands exceed somebody's abilities, we're going to try to avoid that. That's human nature. We all do that. We're going to try to avoid or escape. And so then in my experience, tangible, a lot of what I observe when a traditional behaviorist has labeled a behavior as tangible is that, the student might be, or the child might be, using unconventional means to communicate. So let's say, I think a function of tangible would be that it's time for them to be done with the iPad, and or they've asked to have the iPad and you told them they can't have it. And then there's a behavior. Well, to me, a lot of what I see is they might use behavior because they don't know how to express disappointment appropriate, like in a way that other people can understand really well. And so they might not be able to say, oh, bummer, I really want that iPad. Or they might not be able to say, oh, can I have a few more minutes? Or how about I do the iPad first and then I do my work? My daughter is like really, really, really good at negotiating with me. Maybe the student who's having trouble in this area isn't. And so maybe we need to help them learn some more conventional ways to communicate. And oftentimes it can be, a product of that really rigid environment that says, like, no, you're done. I'm not going to give you any more minutes. And so, that we have to make environmental. It's not always that we have to teach, but sometimes we have to make environmental supports or accommodations or adaptations. But sometimes it is because of unconventional means to communicate. And then sensory, the way it's written in the traditional behaviorist approach, it kind of makes you think that a student is having a behavior to adjust their sensory, like to get a sensory, to intentionally become more regulated. And so I didn't like the way that message was being portrayed. So I just changed it. If a behavior is going to happen because of sensory, it's because the student had sensory dysregulation, or the child had sensory or emotional overwhelm. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen big feelings of happiness lead to behaviors, because it's almost like the student or the child is a boiling pot, and it boils over. They're just so happy that it becomes overwhelming to them. And then, some behaviors come out of that, but that's an experience of overwhelm, whether that's sensory or emotional overwhelm. And then that hypervigilant neuroception of threat. As soon as I learned about that, I was like, where does that fit? That's like such a huge why behind behaviors. And I have kind of reframed the way we say sensory and like lumped it into that is a function. That's a function for a lot of our students, is that hypervigilant neuroception of threat. So why don't we just say that? so that's how I've reframed it. That's how I code it. Like if I have my forms, I have check boxes to mark one of these off, or multiple. A lot of times there's multiple functions for the same for behavior. And so a lot of students who I assess will end up with like multiple boxes checked here. But hopefully that can change by redefining these and using different language. We move away from that thought process that the student is using behavior intentionally because it works for them, and changing that to, this is a need that's unmet, or this is a skill that they don't have solidly learned or mastered, or this is because of the environment and how their demands exceed in their abilities, or they're in sensory dysregulation because we're not providing a sensory safe environment for them. Okay, and then the last thing is I've really moved away from, I think in the traditional, and it took me a while to remember this, but in the traditional forms, teaching alternative behaviors to meet the needs of the function, to meet the function, really sends, again, that language, that's the language you'll see in traditional functional behavioral assessments. And that language sends that message that the student is using a behavior to meet a function. And so I've switched that to, okay, here are the functions. What proactive supports can we use to support those functions? What can we do proactively to support that student? Are there any skills we need to teach? Is there any growth that needs to occur? And then, is the environment accepting and welcoming to neurodivergent characteristics? Are we making, do we have a really rigid environment that's accepting of only one type of learner? Or are we accepting and welcoming all of us to the table, and realizing that that's going to look different for some people, especially for our neurodivergent learners?
Yeah. I think they're about, things like eye contact, and actually having, I can tell you that there was a point in time that was in my son's IEP, until one day I realized it was in his IEP, and said, he doesn't need to look at you. And in fact, for him, that can be difficult, and it can be stressful. So, I think the lack of recognition, even some of the things, the stims that people have that are fully harmless and are helping people to regulate. There's this idea of wanting people to behave differently to fit a certain mold, and that's always really concerning. Wanting to basically teach replacement behaviors based on a neurotypical mindset of what those behaviors should be.
What they should be and what they should look like.
That's
Absolutely
right.
agree.
Right.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. So hopefully this gives you some shifts that you can make in your own process to kind of move this to the 21st century, as I like to say. Move it with what we know currently, based versus what we knew in the 1930s. Come on. And so as a final thought, if you guys just want to share out, now that we know better, what's one change that you can make as you leave today? Because that's the ultimate goal, is that we all have done something, and as disruptors or change makers, that we can do something after leaving today that's going to help impact the students or children or individuals that we support.
And while we're waiting for responses to that, I have a couple things I wanted to bring up. One of them is a question, and this question will be familiar to you. And the question comes from Marion, who says, please, how and where do I buy your book?
I don't have a book, so
You don't have a book yet.
no, yeah, yeah.
You know, Marion, and the reason I brought that up, Marion, is we actually had a conversation today, and I said, you know, you really need to put this together in a book, and you know, you've got a book in you. But what you do have is, of course, you do you know, you do consulting, and what you've created through this, and we didn't really see the end product of what you've created, but you've created kind of a form that can be used by a school or a school district, that really is taking these principles and you know, moving away from that traditional FBA approach into here's a guided approach to help people not only go through the forum but kind of get the mindset. So you've almost
Mhm.
encapsulated the presentation within the forums to help make a leap. And I know you do consulting and training to schools as well. So hypothetically, if somebody was interested in this, maybe it's a teacher administrator watching, how could they learn more, or where could they contact you to learn more about kind of the approach that you've developed, or if they were interested in potentially looking into using your forums, how would people get in hold of you about that?
Sure. Here's my email, so you can absolutely email me. I have a website, and I think we just created like a coming soon tab on that, and you can sign up for to be on my mailing list, and I can like send you out information as the forms become available. It was never my intent to make the forms available to the general public, but people are wanting them, which I think is a great thing.
Mhm.
I did a training in Wisconsin in August of like with 12 different school districts, and every single one of them said, you know, we don't want to recreate the wheel. We just want your forms. And so it took me, it made me take the leap to create, like right now they're fillable forms, which is just an absolute pain. And so I am creating an online form platform where you can, you know, purchase per use. It's, you know, like if you just want one functional, you know, assessment and plan for a student, you can purchase one. And then as a team, you can fill that out and go through this process. Phase one should be done at the end of February. So it's not going to be a super long, by the end of the school year, it should be available for people.
Mhm.
And my end goal is to have like videos at each box. So like a video lesson of me teaching the team how to fill out each box within the
Mhm.
form.
Mhm.
Because I do not want these forms to be utilized incorrectly. Like I
Mhm.
want them to be, you know, a part of this lens change and this shift.
Mhm.
um, and so definitely there'll be like embedded videos on how to do that also.
Mhm. Mhm. Great.
I don't know of
Um,
a book. After this project, I'm such a perfectionist. I'm not sure how anybody writes. I always tell Dr. Lori, like, I give you so much credit because
uh,
it might take me 10 years to write a book.
I'm going to keep the pressure on. I think you've got it in you. But you know, I think again, in the meantime, you know, going to your website, you know, this is a form that, you know, if a school or school district was interested in, that they could reach out to you, and you know, of course, you offer training as well. Somebody
Mhm.
asked here, and I think this was related, if I can find it, and I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Have you been successful in getting other schools or BCBAs to use your forms for an FBA? And can you tell us just a little bit about some of the successes you've had?
I've had a lot of success. I'm like, a lot of people ask me about that. Like, do I get pushback? If a district hires me to do a functional behavioral assessment, I use my forms. I mean, like, it's the only way I wouldn't be able to sleep at night doing a traditional form. So you can't hire me to do a traditional FBA. And the feedback has overwhelmingly been positive. Again, that's why I'm moving toward, especially from teachers. I mean, like they want a system that makes sense to them. I feel almost like the traditional functional behavioral approach speaks a completely different language, and it doesn't take into consideration that a staff member has 25 to 22 to 25, at least in Wisconsin, other kids that they're taking care of in their classroom. And so I think this makes it manageable for teachers and manageable for staff supporting students. So yes, that's why I've decided this year to just create a software platform, because I've had so many districts want to use it. I have a handful of districts using it right now to give me feedback, so that I can make sure it's the best version of what it can be. And so some districts are already using it in its fillable form or in its unfillable form, just to like give me some more feedback on how it's working for them. Now in Wisconsin, we have been bringing Ross Green in for many, many, many years. We were contracted with him with the state, I believe. We used to be, I don't know if we still are. And so perhaps we were ready for it, and maybe other states aren't. I don't know. But I have people from our applied educational neuroscience cohort last year and this year using it, and the feedback has been really positive so far.
That's great.
I mean, trust me, I ask for critical feedback. Like, I want the critical
Absolutely.
feedback.
Absolutely. Well, I know that well,
Exactly.
So we've got a bunch of comments here. I'm going to try to get to a couple of them real quickly, but I know we are, have kind of gone through our time here. I would also encourage people to, share this presentation. Part of the reason we do these events is that we really want to, share with others, ideas for making progress. And, like you said, there are states that are further along than others, but it's those states that have not moved very far along that really need people like you that are watching this to share these things and to try to begin to do some lens changes. So I definitely saw some comments about sharing this, and people have made a number of comments here. David said, I share with my son's district and his care team. Let's say my son's story. The school looks at me as if I'm not right. Well, that just changed last meeting with an attorney and his neurologist. So David kind of getting the point that sometimes, you need to do more. But certainly, sharing these things and trying to find people that might be receptive is always helpful. Let me just look through a couple of these comments here. Let's see. Bear with me here.
Yeah, speaking to David's comment, I have been involved in many situations with advocates and lawyers on both sides of the team. So,
right.
So yes, sometimes that's what it takes, sadly.
Yeah. Judy asked if you will share the slide presentation. Slides are very helpful. And of course, the recorded presentation will be available. If you are able to make the slides available, if you want to follow up with an email with me, I can always make those available to people that request them. So if anyone that's interested, let me first ask Connie, would you be willing to do that if folks were interested?
Sure. Just give me a couple days, because I want to make just a few tweaks. So yes,
that perfectionism, right?
Exactly.
So Judy, if you're interested, shoot me an email. It's guystevens@endtheseclusion.org. And I'd be happy to send that along when I get that back from Connie. And a number of people mentioned that they were signing up to get the information from you.
Thanks, Jillian.
Yep. And a lot of people, the ones that signed up are, let's see, friend Floyd said to gain a better understanding of where my coworkers are coming from and have the language accessible to assert, and kind of answering your question here, assert my concerns and inspire people to adopt more helpful mindsets and approaches. So Floyd, really happy to hear that, this is going to be helpful to you. Floyd's a fantastic advocate that I know well. And we also have a comment here from Lauren, who's another fantastic person as well. I know the answer to this, but Connie, will adult versions of the Y toolkit be available?
Yes, they absolutely will. I have, there will be a student version and an adult version. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Lauren.
Yep. And in that vein, Marion said, thank you so very much. I support adults. Supported living. The number of different support staff carers who come and go through their lives is ridiculous. So much stress just from how they need to live. How to support staff to understand the value and importance of their presence. Thank you. So that's a great take-home message as well. And I'm sure I missed a few here, but in being mindful of your time, and I'm going to go ahead and take your presentation off here. I just want to thank you, Connie, for taking some time with us today. I've been excited about the work that you've been doing. And, I think that this has a lot of really positive potential. The more we can shift lenses, the more places that people shift lenses, the better outcomes we're going to have for kids, because we know that so many kids are ending up on the wrong side of things in the name of behavior. So in the name of behavior, it's restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. It's kids being pushed down the school to prison pipeline. And, it starts with how do we change a system that's not working for our kids? And I think this is really inspiring. So I want to thank you so much and give you a chance if there's any final words or final wisdom you want to leave us with.
No, I can't remember the commenter's name that just commented about adults. And I just want to say, like, I know that dearly. That's near and dear to my heart. I have an older sister with cerebral palsy who actually, requires 100% care. And I think that's where my passion comes from. First of all, it's so hard to find good support for adults. Like my mom got to the point where, she's now in her 80s taking care of my sister alone with nobody helping except for us, because so much staff turnover and inadequate staff like training. And just when that happens, bad things happen. And over time, you lose your trust in the system. And two, from a physical standpoint, I remember my very first job when I worked with autistic students in an amazing school. And parents would say, people are so mean to us when we go in the community. And, we were started doing individual field trips to help students succeed in the community and like take that pressure off the parents. Like, I can't go to Target. My son wants a balloon and I can't give him a balloon, and he has a full meltdown and everybody stares at me and says mean things. And I was so shocked because, for having a sister with a disability in a wheelchair, like people were nice. I used to say we should put a bucket in her hands and we'd get money. Like we could put her on they were so sweet to her, they were nice to her. They were good to her. And so I always say, nobody would do that to my sister. Nobody would say, get up and walk or you're going to be punished. Or if you can walk or if you can feed yourself, we're going to give you 5 stickers. But we do that to kids with behavior and social and emotional needs every single day. And it's not right. And that's what needs to change. We need to be looking at, some of these social and emotional differences and behaviors in the same way that we look at physical changes, physical disabilities. So.
As you were speaking, I just put up a couple of the really nice comments from folks, and I think people definitely appreciate it. What you've shared with us today. Normally, this is the part of the presentation that I let you go and I talk about who's coming up next. But I thought it would be fun because our next guest fairly well. If you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot here for a second, and bear with me because I'm going to share my screen here in a second just to share about our upcoming presentation. So as you mentioned a couple of times, we will have Dr. Lori Desautel joining us for our next presentation. That's in January 27th. And actually, as I mentioned early on, I met you initially because I had the honor to going to one of Dr. Lori's classes and talking about restraint and seclusion. And ironically, I'm doing that again that same week, the week of January 27th. I'm coming to Lori's twice, and she's coming to the Alliance once. So we'll have a great opportunity to do that. But I wondered if you might want to just say a few words about the applied educational neuroscience program that you had done there, because I think it's a great program. And so I'm going to put you on the spot if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all. It was an amazing certification. And, last year when the whole world shut down and I was virtual for most of the year, thank gosh, Dr. Lori let me in like last minute in the spring of the shutdown, the year that we were all shut down. And it's just been, I've met so many wonderful people, so many like-minded individuals that we bonded so well as a cohort. You're together for a year. I believe she's still doing this virtually. You learn about, neuroscience with a specific emphasis on trauma and adversity. And, I can't say enough good things about Dr. Lori. She's amazing. She never stops. She has such a passion. I'm not sure how she gets everything in that she does in a day, but it's a wonderful program. And she's an amazing leader and teacher.
Absolutely. And of course, she's actually going to be coming talking to us about some new work that she's been doing related to the polyvagal theory. So that fits in really well with what we've been talking about throughout your presentation today. And also, I just want to say the Dr. Lori is amazing. One thing that rivals the amazingness of Dr. Lori is the students. I've had a great privilege of meeting you and several of the students that have gone through this program. And they are people that are out there changing the world. And I do mean world. I'm thinking about Anna, who I talked to from New Zealand recently, who has gone through the program. Or I got an email from Angie, who's a teacher here in the DC area that's doing amazing things. The people that have gone through this program are really doing amazing things. So if you know an educator who really wants to learn more, you are an educator, look it up. It's at Butler University. And if you look for applied educational neuroscience, you can learn more about the program. So
and what I love about Lori, one more plug-in, is that Dr. Lori is in the classrooms herself I think 2 times a week. It may be more now, but at least 2 times a week, she's in the school practicing what she's teaching. And I've always said that as somebody who's a consultant. If I ever get to the place where, I'm so far removed of what a school really is, then I don't want to be doing this anymore. And that,
That's right.
I
That's
mean,
right.
so that's another wonderful thing about her is anything
Yeah.
she tells you, she's doing herself in
And not
classrooms.
only practicing, but adapting, learning.
Mhm.
She's written several books now, and she'll go into the classroom and continue to evolve what she's doing. So really
Mhm.
fantastic.
Mhm.
On that note, I am going to wrap up here. Connie, if you want to hang on for 1 second, I'm going to go ahead and
Sure.
end the broadcast. But thank you everybody who watched today. I know we were a little bit long today, but I think there's a lot of great information. So we will be joining you again in 2 weeks, and look forward to seeing you then. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.